In the summer of 1943, as Allied troops landed in Sicily, a quiet shift of power was already underway. The Americans weren't just fighting the Axis. They were making alliances with the men who truly controlled the island, the Mafia bosses. Sicily had long been a place where outsiders came to claim it, and its people learned how to survive by making themselves indispensable. It was an island molded by conquest, a land where the Mafia had evolved as a shadow government, making and breaking leaders for generations. When the Americans came, one name rose above all the others: Don Calogero Vizzini, or Don Kalo. To the Allies, he was General Mafia. To the Sicilians, he was the man who decided who lived and who died. On July 14, 1943, 4 days after the first Allied troops came ashore, an American fighter swooped low over the town of Villalba. It dropped a package near the church. The next morning another package fell, this one closer to the home of Don Kalo himself. By the 15th, a messenger was riding out of Villalba to Musomelli with a letter for Giuseppe Gencorusso, the Mafia's second in command. The message was in coded language. The Americans were coming, and Don Kalo was going to help. By the 20th, with the 7th Army still 30 miles away, a lone jeep tried to pick up the old boss. It got lost, came under Italian fire, and one of the Americans was killed. Later that day, 3 tanks rolled into Villalba and found him. An American officer emerged from the lead tank, speaking fluent Sicilian. The people watched as the soldier and the Mafia boss met. Don Kalo came out slowly, shirt sleeves rolled, suspenders hanging. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. His reputation spoke for itself. At 66, he was a thick-set man with a lizard's stare, a slight waddle, and a rare, unhurried voice. In Sicily, a boss didn't advertise himself. He didn't wear silk or jewel-studded rings. He wore plain shirt sleeves and gave few words, making sure every word landed like a hammer. Don Kalo had learned long ago that silence was its own form of command. That night, the Americans put him and his nephew, Damiano Lumia, in a tank and rolled out. By morning, the Italian defences at Camerata had dissolved. 2/3 of the garrison deserted, many of them approached in the dark by Mafia men. They were offered a way out, civilian clothes, a path home, a chance to forget the war and return to their families. By the end of the day, the Italian commander was captured by Mafia agents in Musomelli. Not a shot was fired. In the west, the war ended quietly. In the east, the British and Canadians were still fighting bloody battles for Etna. But in western Sicily, the Mafia had reshaped the invasion. The Americans gave Don Kalo the credit he wanted and needed. His followers spoke of him as the man who had opened the door for the Allies, the one who saved countless lives by ending the fighting before it started. The Americans called him General Mafia. The Sicilians called him their protector. Both were right. In the days that followed, Don Kalo stepped fully into the role he had built for himself over a lifetime. A man above politics, above ideology, a figure who spoke for the ancient code of the land. At 66, he had earned the reputation that would carry him for the rest of his life. To the Americans, he was an ally. To the Sicilians, he was the only man fit to rule. The old order was gone. The new one would have Don Kalo's stamp across every town in Sicily. In the dark and bloody past of Sicily, a monstrous thing was born. Savage misrule created a tradition of violence that shaped the island and its people. The men who lived by that tradition came to be called the Mafia. To outsiders, they were criminals. To themselves, and to the peasants who feared and relied upon them, they were something else, an ancient force, a shadow of primitive justice. The Mafia lived by its own code. To the church, to the state, it was an outlaw order. Yet in its oldest, purest form, it possessed an iron morality. A mafioso didn't consider himself a thief. The Mafia punished petty crime and protected its own, and often acted as an ally to the very authorities trying to destroy it. Its laws came from a world of tribal cruelty and harsh necessity. Its bosses acted like patriarchs, shielding their followers and rewarding loyalty with a ruthlessness born of survival. A capo would kill to preserve order and justify it with a shrug. As one American boss, Nick Gentile, said about a troublesome young mobster, "There was nothing we could do with him, so he had to be rubbed out. We embalmed the body and sent it back to Sicily. His folks were poor, so we put a diamond ring on his finger. We figured otherwise he'd end up in the chair, and they wouldn't even get the body." To Gentile, that was mercy. Feuds were born the same way. Between 1872 and 1878, the Fratuzzi and Stopaglieri clans turned a quiet stretch of Bagheria and Monreale into a killing ground. It started when Giuseppe Lipari of the Fratuzzi violated the code and spoke to the police. The Stopaglieri demanded blood. The Fratuzzi refused. The vendetta ignited. In a matter of years, countless men were dragged into a war of mutual annihilation. Young cousins, distant relatives, men who had never met, were hunted down and killed. The countryside was stripped of its men, families wiped out, villages terrorized. By the end, only a handful remained. Salvatore D'Amico, a Fratuzzi, went to the authorities and confessed every crime he knew, hoping death would finally find him. The Fratuzzi granted him that mercy, silenced him for breaking the code, and closed the book on one of the bloodiest chapters in Mafia history. Even decades later, the weight of that code remained. In 1944, in the Poggio Reale prison in Naples, an aging mafioso named D'Agostino was put on display for privileged visitors. Small, gaunt, a man with tiny hands and wary eyes, he had wiped out an entire family with an axe, a vendetta killing he would serve 50 years for. The warders treated him with a respect granted to no general. They called him Lei instead of the contemptuous Tu. When asked if he would kill again, if given the chance, he shrugged. "Honor's honor, and a vendetta's a vendetta. You don't choose. Destiny puts its big fat thumb on your neck and squeezes." The warders nodded. They understood. To the Mafia, vengeance was sacred. The rules were ancient and precise. A man would swallow an insult like poison, bury the injury deep, and wait for the right moment to kill, even if it meant smiling and shaking hands with the man he intended to bury. When a wounded man was asked by the police to name his attacker, he would reply, "If I die, may God forgive him. If I live, I'll settle my own accounts." That was the Sicilian omertà, an oath to silence, a code that was stronger than the law, stronger than death itself. For generations, the Mafia was a machine, a sprawling, brutal mechanism rooted deep in Sicily, shaped by its geography and its history. An island conquered and abandoned, bled by Romans, Normans, Arabs, Bourbons, and countless others, Sicily learned early that no central force would ever save it. Its people would save themselves. The Mafia rose from that void, filling the spaces left by kings and invaders, extracting its toll from every transaction, every grain of wheat shipped across the seas. The Mafia learned its trade as a primitive state within a state. By the 19th century, it had made itself the invisible hand of politics. It whipped rural mobs into frenzies when needed, turned peasant anger against landlords, the church, or the police. In its early days, it was a weapon of rebellion. Gradually, it evolved into a parasite, a force that shaped votes, rigged elections, and twisted democracy into a ritual of intimidation. At the polls, it was the Mafia that decided outcomes. The choice offered to the farmer was brutal and simple. Vote for the right candidate, or lose your livelihood, your land, or your life. By the turn of the century, Under the watch of bosses like Don Vito Cascioferro, the Mafia had perfected its grip. Cascioferro called it the pizzu, the wetting of the beak, the toll that every man had to pay if he wanted to work, to live, to prosper. From the markets of Palermo to the sulphur mines and the tombs of ancient ruins, the Mafia had its finger in every trade. The beggar was assigned a corner, the merchant paid a tax, the farmer gave a portion of his crop. Even thieves knew their place. The Mafia returned stolen goods for a price, making itself a necessary force, a dealer in order and silence. For the wealthy, the Mafia spoke velvet words. Extortion came by handwritten letters, adorned with old-fashioned pleasantries, a faint hint of regret, and a very specific price. Refusal was rare. The Mafia promised results, and it delivered. The state solved one case in 10. The Mafia solved 9. Its price was higher, its methods brutal, but its word was iron. Through it all, one truth remained. The Mafia was more than a gang. It was an ancient engine built to survive in a land where no one came to save you. Its leaders were patriarchs, its soldiers disciples. Its code was silence, loyalty, and vengeance, and it shaped the island long before any invader set foot upon its shores. For centuries, Sicily was a land shaped by a brutal paradox, a feudal order that refused to die. The island had been a conquest, a possession, a place where kings, barons, and outsiders came to take their share, then departed, leaving the peasants to bear the weight. The Mafia rose from that soil, first as a shadow, then as its keeper. At first, it came as the champion of the oppressed, but over time it became the ruler, the owner, and in many ways, the only authority that mattered. Through the long Sicilian nights, the main streets of tiny hill towns became the stage for this quiet ritual of despair. The unemployed wandered endlessly, farmers, shopkeepers, ruined tradesmen, pacing the narrow, shadeless streets. They spoke with gestures more precise than words, a pantomime of survival. The bells of the piazza rang like a reminder of another century, another era, and silence settled again. The men drifted, going nowhere, like prisoners pacing behind invisible bars. Their women, unseen, watched from the shuttered windows, as powerless as their men. Feudalism hadn't evolved in Sicily. It was festering. The land had never truly been sold, only leased. The barons kept their titles, the gabelotti held their concessions, and the peasants worked fields that were never meant to belong to them. The system was brutal and inefficient, a parasite that refused to die because no one came to kill it. Then came Don Kalo Vizzini. The Mafia had long been a shadow over the land, a force called upon by the barons to crush peasant uprisings to protect the status quo. But under Don Kalo, that balance shifted. The barons were tired, degenerate, detached. The Mafia, hardened by a century of betrayal and poverty, stepped forward to claim the land itself. In 1922, when the Suora Marchesa estate came up for auction, Don Kalo bid for it. He was the only bidder. No one else dared raise a hand. The land sold for a fraction of its worth. The lesson was learned quickly. The Mafia was no longer an instrument of the barons. It was their successor. The leases came cheaper and cheaper. The Mafia didn't just collect rents anymore. They became the landlords. A few aristocrats tried to resist. They put down their telescopes, pulled on farmers' corduroys, and tried to defend their vines and cattle. But a night or two later, a percentage of those vines would be found slashed, a few cattle with their throats cut, and the barons would quietly return to their palaces and close the gates. The Mafia had replaced them. Then came Don Kalo's biggest play. As Mussolini came to power and the war ended, he proposed a cooperative for returning veterans. The government, blind or complicit, granted free land and equipment. The cooperative was placed under the watchful eye of Don Salvatore, the parish priest and Don Kalo's brother. Not a single veteran ever received a plot. The land was worked for the benefit of the Vizzini clan, and when the scandal broke, a charge of fraud was brought. The case lingered for 20 years and was finally buried when the Allies arrived. 3 other cooperatives tried and failed. Crops were set ablaze. Animals were poisoned. The farms withered. The Mafia had made its point. In the hills of Villalba and beyond, there was no room for a rival order. Through the lean years of Mussolini's regime, Don Kalo kept his head down and his connections closer. At first, he hedged, wary of Il Duce and his promises of a new, orderly Italy. The Mafia boss gave a hefty donation to the March on Rome, a calculated bet. But as Mussolini tightened his grip and announced he would eradicate the Mafia, Don Kalo was suddenly in the crosshairs, exiled for 5 years. What saved him was a stroke of chance. In 1922, long before the purge, a young politician had arrived at the Vizzini estate seeking refuge. He was a fugitive, a squadrista on the run for a political murder. And Don Kalo gave him a hiding place until the storm passed. Years later, that man became an Undersecretary of State. And when the order came down to remove Don Kalo, one letter from the grateful politician was enough to win the Mafia boss his release. Through war and fascism, through exile and betrayal, Don Kalo endured. By the time the Allies arrived, he was ready to reclaim the throne he had built, a throne that would rise from the ruins of an ancient land, and from a Mafia that refused to die. Calogero Vizzini was born in 1877, the son of a peasant sharp enough to marry above his station. The Scarlata family had a small piece of land, rare in a town like Villalba, and a reputation for piety, thanks to a relative in the church. In western Sicily, where almost every man worked someone else's soil, that counted for something. The land was harsh, ugly, a world apart from the tourist spots at Etna or Taormina. The western hills weren't made for beauty, they were made for survival. Villalba was one of 100 dusty towns that existed for one reason only, to raise the peasants who worked the great feudal estates. The barons lived in Palermo and left their land to be run by leaseholders, the Gabellotti. These were often mafiosi, men who farmed the farms by extracting the highest rents, keeping the sharecroppers under their thumb. The landless ploughman and the day labourer were at the very bottom, making just enough to survive. For the gifted boy born into that misery, the church offered the only way out. Don Kalo's uncle became the bishop of Murolucano, and another cousin rose to the bishopric of Noto and founded a holy order. Another brother was the parish priest in Villalba, a man who combined piety with sharp business instincts. He made money on agricultural cooperatives and served as a reminder that church and mafia often worked hand in hand. Young Calogero learned early that in Villalba, strength and reputation meant more than the law. At 17, he led a gang that beat a young magistrate's assistant nearly to death for trying to court a girl he had claimed as his own. By the following year, he was working the Cancia, transporting grain across bandit-ridden roads from farms to mills controlled by mafia clans. To operate in that world meant belonging to it. At 25, he was a man of respect, a zoo, an uncle. The highest title a man could hold, and one that announced to Sicily that he had arrived. By 1914, when the First World War began, Don Kalo was already pezzo di novanta, a big shot in the Mafia. The army came calling, requisitioning horses for the cavalry and mules for the guns. Don Kalo turned the crisis into a racket. He made a deal with the military commission. First, he sold them every broken-down nag and sick mule he could find. Second, he taxed every farmer who refused to have their animals requisitioned. And when the commission came looking for strong horses, he delivered stolen stock at premium prices. Most of the animals died long before reaching the front lines, old, sick, starved beasts that dropped where they stood. The scandal became one of the biggest in Italian military history. General Moccia was dispatched to investigate, and soon Don Kalo and a group of army officers found themselves in court. But when the witness stand came calling, every man who had once talked refused to speak. Those who had implicated him in the press suddenly fell silent. 9 witnesses were charged with perjury or muteness of malice and punished on the spot. The rest watched, learned, and kept their mouths shut. The court acquitted Don Kalo, cementing his reputation as a man with friends in the army, the administration, and Parliament itself. He emerged more than a boss. He became a symbol, the second most important mafia figure on the island, granted the honorific Don. Through the trials and scandal, one fact became clear. The Mafia was no longer a local gang. It was an institution. The state came and went. The Mafia remained. With the war came opportunity, and Don Kalo was a man who knew how to use it. The Mafia had long been a force in Sicily, siding with Garibaldi to overthrow the Bourbons, extracting its toll from every shift in power. In Don Kalo, that old legacy found its modern form. By the early 20th century, the Mafia had evolved from a rural secret society into a sprawling state within a state, a parallel structure that shaped politics, commerce, and daily life. The Sicily that molded Don Kalo was a harsh, inward place. Its peasants weren't farmers, but subjects of a feudal order that refused to die. The land was worked by men who rose before dawn, plodded through the streets of tiny villages, and set out for the fields that still bore the stamp of Roman slave farms. The only buildings left isolated were the strongholds of the great estates, granaries, warehouses, and watchtowers, protected by armed guards and mafia muscle. Even the landless had their place in the mafia's order. An untouchable caste of petty criminals lived at the edges of the fields, raiding pagliai, temporary peasant shelters, until the mafia hunted them down and killed them like animals. The mafia refused to tolerate unauthorized crime. In its world, every deed had its price, every offense its retaliation, every corner of the land its claim. Even decades later, when visitors came to Italy and stopped at the new motels built by the oil companies, the rules remained the same. In the north, a guest was told to empty their car and lock it tight. In Sicily, that warning was unnecessary. Whatever a man left in a car was safe because the mafia allowed it to be. The visitor didn't know it, but in that moment he was under their protection, and every lira he spent came with the pizzu, the price for belonging. Here was the world Don Kalo shaped and inherited, a place where silence spoke louder than guns, where honor was enforced with terror, and where one man could stand above the rest and call himself the voice of an ancient land. By the early 1920s, Don Calogero Vizzini had become one of the highest-ranking mafia bosses in Sicily. The title of Don announced him as more than a man. He was an institution. But even giants can stumble when new forces rise. In 1924, Benito Mussolini arrived in Sicily, and with him came a reckoning. The Duce had long suspected the mafia was a parasite, feeding off Italy's feudal past, a force that thrived only when the state weakened. In Sicily, even fascist courts were powerless. Witnesses refused to speak. Police were met with silence. In Palermo, a party official could be gunned down in broad daylight on the bustling Via Maqueda, and when the authorities came, no one claimed to have heard the shots. A carabinieri officer put it simply. There are only 2 types of witness. The first live where the crime happened and heard nothing. The second have seen the suspect standing quietly on his balcony when the shot was fired. By the 1920s, the mafia controlled the electoral machine, sending deputies to Parliament to block investigations and making the very idea of its existence seem like a myth. Meanwhile, in tiny Favara, the mafia racked up 150 murders in a single year. Only 1 man died of natural causes. More galling for Mussolini was the mafia's betrayal during the First World War. as conscripts departed for the front, the old rumor surfaced once more, that Sicilian recruits would be castrated as soon as they set foot in northern Italy. The Mafia offered escape to those who could pay, and by 1918, Sicily swarmed with deserters. To Mussolini, dreaming of a Roman Empire reborn, it was treason. The breaking point came in 1924. The Duce, touring Sicily, announced he wanted to visit the remote town of Piana dei Greci, an Albanian Sicilian enclave with a long history of resistance. The police bristled. The area was a stronghold of rural defiance. Even more troubling was its mayor, Don Ciccio Cuccia, a mafia boss famous for his ego and bravado. Years earlier, Cuccia had pulled a stunt that made him infamous across the island. When King Victor Emmanuel came to visit, Cuccia managed to separate the bored and irritable monarch from his retinue and drag him into an Albanian church service. Before the king could protest, he was made godfather to Cuccia's newborn son. The honor came with a royal commendation, a cross of a cavalier of the crown of Italy, and cemented the mafia boss's reputation as a man too bold for rules. In 1924, when Mussolini arrived, Cuccia tried the same routine. The Duce was placed in the mayor's car for a drive through the town. "Why all the police?" Cuccia announced, voice booming across the square. "With me, you have all the protection you need. I am the one who gives the orders here." That was the moment Mussolini understood just how deeply the Mafia had dug into the state. He refused Cuccia's offer to dismiss the escort. In retaliation, the mayor cleared the town square, making sure the Duce addressed an audience of beggars, one-legged veterans, bootblacks, and pickpockets. The photographs were a humiliation. The speech was a disaster. The infamous scowl that crossed Mussolini's face became the signal for war. Days later, he announced publicly what he had decided in silence at Piana dei Greci. The Mafia had gone too far. The Duce would break its spine. Mussolini chose Prefect Cesare Mori to carry out the campaign. Mori was a policeman with 3 decades of arrests and convictions to his name, a man as methodical as he was brutal. The Duce gave him a free hand, and Mori gave the campaign a name to match its ambitions: the Plan Attila. With it came terror. Mori rounded up suspects by the hundreds, by the shipload, sending countless men to penal islands on little more than suspicion. Trials became parodies. Witnesses refused to speak, evidence disappeared, and Mori responded with brute force. Torture, long outlawed in theory, became routine. The cassetta, a wooden box used to restrain a suspect, reappeared. Brine was poured over a prisoner's bare chest, followed by flogging. Salt water was forced down their throat until the stomach bloated. Fingernails were torn out. Skin was flayed. Genitals were twisted or crushed. The Mafia, long accustomed to cruelty, was now introduced to its modern, state-sponsored twin. Mori acted like an emperor. When warned that snipers were shooting carabinieri from behind walls, he ordered every wall in Sicily lowered to 3 feet. In Parliament, Mussolini announced victory. Holding Mori's arm aloft, he called him the flame of fascist justice. In reality, Mori had scythed down only the weakest elements of the Mafia: the rank and file, the unconnected, the unlucky. The top bosses, lawyers and doctors found ways to move beyond Mori's grip, joining the fascist party or crossing into Tunisia and America. But Mori claimed one great prize: Don Vito Cascioferro, the old godfather of the Sicilian Mafia. Cascioferro had long been a mythic figure, a veteran of the Black Hand in New York, and a suspect in dozens of killings. Among them was the murder of New York detective Joseph Petrosino, who had traveled to Sicily in 1909 to investigate the link between the Black Hand and the Mafia. According to Cascioferro, Petrosino's death was an act of honor. "He came challenging a man who refused to be hunted," he said. "I gave him an answer." Mori brought Ferro to trial on a smuggling charge. The Mafia boss was defiant. "Gentlemen," he announced in court, "you have failed to prove any of the countless crimes you accuse me of. So, you condemn me for the only one I didn't commit." The state claimed its victory, but Ferro made sure the Mafia would survive. From prison, he acted as its steward, creating a fund for the families of jailed bosses and ensuring loyalty remained a currency stronger than fear. His wardens became servants. His cell was a shrine. The Mafia adjusted to its new reality. It would wait, adapt, and rise again. Through Don Vito Ferro's fall, Don Calogero Vizzini rose to claim the throne of the honored society. The state had clipped the branches, but the roots remained deep, twisted into the soil of Sicily itself. By the mid-1930s, Mussolini had tried to crush the Mafia. The fascist raids had torn into its ranks, hauling bosses out of their villages, filling prisons, forcing men into hiding. Yet the structure held. The old lions waited for better days. And while the fascists had no mercy for those in their way, the Mafia came to respect their methods. In 1962, the Sicilian paper L'Ora shook the island when it published the confession of Dr. Melchiorre Allegra, a medical officer recruited into the honored society during the First World War. Under threat and seduction, he revealed how deep and orderly the Mafia truly was. It started in 1916. The doctor was working in a military hospital when a man named Giulio D'Agate came to him, soft-spoken, respectful, and representing the Mafia. Daggett asked him to turn a blind eye to a case of self-inflicted wounds, hinting that mercy came with a price. A few days later, Daggett returned with 2 more men of respect and laid it out plainly. This was an association that crossed every class, every line of society. Its rule was absolute. Its violence was administered like law, only with the permission of the chiefs. To kill without it was a death sentence. To kill with it meant support from the family itself. Allegra was pressed to join, and he understood he had no choice. Too much had been said already. The ritual was quick. A pinprick drew a bead of blood. The drop fell on a holy image, which was burned as he swore loyalty and obedience. No handshakes, no riddles, just an oath. The doctor was brought into the fold and introduced to the right men. From that point on, he treated the wounded in silence and kept their secrets. The Mafia operated like a business. Families grouped by area, led by elected bosses, counseled by trusted advisors. They kept in touch across provinces, across oceans, North and South America, North Africa, Marseille. The election of leaders mimicked democracy. The boss of every family voted for the capo dei capi, the boss of bosses, and in America, they called him the king. By 1943, the Allies came to Sicily. The invasion saved the Mafia. The island was in ruins, its people desperate and broken. The lira was worthless, families scavenged for food, and women sold themselves to feed their children. Meanwhile, the Mafia rebuilt itself, feeding on the ruins. The police were powerless. The prisons had been smashed open by Allied bombs, releasing hundreds of hardened criminals. Bandits and deserters swelled their numbers. Trains were robbed. Flocks were driven off. Kidnappings became routine. The rural barons paid protection money and offered their estates as hideouts. Then came the separatist movement. In September 1945, in a villa outside Palermo, the leaders of the Sicilian separatist cause met to plot their revolution. The Duca di Carcacci, nobles and barons, came together with one man, Don Kalo Vizzini. In his rumpled suit and thick peasant dialect, he spoke with brutal clarity. The old idea of a popular uprising was too dangerous. An armed rabble could easily turn communist. Instead, he proposed to co-opt the bandits, make them patriots, give their gangs a cause, a flag, and a uniform. Let the police fear the outlaw, and the outlaw fear the Mafia. The separatist leaders agreed. They chose Salvatore Giuliano, the 23-year-old king of Montelepre, as their symbol. In a warehouse outside Montelepre, Giuliano was named a colonel, promised amnesty, and handed a banner. It was hastily designed by the movement's psychological warfare team, a map of Italy and America, one soldier cutting the chain binding Sicily to the mainland, another binding it to the United States. For Giuliano and the Mafia, it was a bargain made in blood. For Sicily, it was another chapter in the long story of ruin and betrayal. In a land where water came from ancient Roman cisterns and power came from the point of a knife, the lines between bandit and hero, boss and politician had long ago disappeared. After the war with Sicily in ruins, the Mafia came back stronger than ever. Its bosses read the situation clearly. In the short term, the opportunities were endless. In the long term, it would be dangerous unless Sicily became its own state. Don Kalo, now the undisputed godfather of Sicily, put the idea on the table. The separatist movement embraced it, and with it came Salvatore Giuliano, the bandit king of Montelepre. At 23, Giuliano was already a legend. He had taken to the hills 2 years earlier, after a routine stop by the Carabinieri ended in a bloody shootout. The police were hauling in small-time black marketers like Giuliano for smuggling contraband flour while ignoring the wealthy and well-connected. Cornered and wounded, Giuliano killed one of the Carabinieri and went on the run. He responded with audacity. In a matter of weeks, he freed a group of prisoners from Monreale prison and built a gang. When the authorities rounded up Montelepre locals in retaliation, Giuliano came down from the mountains, ambushed the police escort, and gunned down one of their men in the town square. It was a scene fit for the movies. The press loved him for it. He had a flair for the dramatic. He stripped the weapons and boots from Carabinieri sent to kill him, and then returned the gear later, for maximum public effect. The people of Montelepre rallied to him. Shepherds acted as spotters, whistling across the hills to alert him when strangers came near. He spoke openly about a campaign for the downtrodden and lived by the Robin Hood code: kill only the guilty, protect the poor, given to those in need. Giuliano claimed to be no bandit. To him, he was a revolutionary soldier. Yet, he kept one foot in the outlawed world and another in the political one, accepting overtures from the Mafia and the separatist movement. By 1945, he was at the center of both, a charismatic, ruthless, and calculating fighter, making himself a symbol of resistance. Giuliano ruled the hills like a warlord. In Montelepre, he acted as judge and executioner. Common criminals were tried and shot. Those caught stealing from the poor were condemned to death and left with signs that read, "Giuliano does not steal from the poor." Even within his own ranks, betrayal or cruelty was punished with a bullet. He spoke openly about honor. A rich man doesn't miss a million liar, but if you take a sack of wheat from a peasant, you ruin him, he said. To him, a crime against the people was the worst of all offenses. In this way, he won their loyalty. He acted as benefactor when he chose, arriving like a miracle with a handful of banknotes for an old woman about to be evicted or paying a farmer's debts. But Giuliano was not a liberator. Not really. To keep himself afloat, he embraced alliances with corrupt landowners and worked hand in hand with the Mafia. The very forces he swore to destroy molded him into their weapon. Whatever idealism he possessed was subsumed by the brutal machinery of greed and betrayal. In the end, the Mafia pulled the strings, and Salvatore Giuliano became a marionette, a young outlaw with a machine gun, doing their bidding. By the winter of 1945, the rural police were outmatched and humiliated. Maresciallo Calandra, a veteran of the Montelepre barracks, was running a garrison that was falling apart. His men had no supplies, no fresh boots, no backup. The bandits had automatic weapons and hand grenades. The Carabinieri had old rifles and a few revolvers. Even when Calandra acted on solid intelligence, someone always leaked it. The bandits would vanish into the hills hours before a raid, leaving the carabinieri to stumble back empty-handed. As the separatist movement gained momentum, Giuliano refused to move from the mountains of Montelepre, ignoring pleas from its commander Concetto Gallo to rally elsewhere. The delays crippled the movement and forced it to fill its ranks with volunteers from Palermo and Catania, idealistic students and unemployed clerks drafted to fill the spaces. When these volunteers arrived at the separatist camp at Monte San Mauro, the reality of the campaign became clear. They weren't greeted by warriors, but by the Nisimizi, a ragged, sad lot of ex-labourers and petty criminals, men with nicknames like Muckrake and Chewed Nose. These weren't fighters. They were misfits drafted by circumstance, doing the bidding of bosses and barons. For all the talk of revolution and honour, the lines were blurring. The boy from Montelepre, the bandit king, had become a weapon in a bigger game. The Mafia watched from the shadows, and Giuliano, despite the slogans and the bravado, was already a prisoner of their design. After the war, the Mafia put its weight behind an idea that felt as bold as it was desperate. Break Sicily from Italy and make it a state of its own. The bosses teamed up with bandits like Salvatore Giuliano and a ragged assortment of outlaw gangs and aristocrats. Weapons were smuggled in, volunteers recruited and trained, and a force began to form. Then came the waiting. October turned to November, and the promises, guns, money, troops, never arrived. General Gallo, commander of the separatist army, was left with a handful of men and no resources. To fill the gaps, he pressed the bandits into service. They raided farms and estates, stealing cattle and grain, burning buildings when the owners refused to pay. At one estate, after the owner ignored demands for 2 million lire, the band returned and smashed equipment, doused a wine warehouse with gasoline, and blew it apart with a flamethrower. The explosion buried the man holding it. Another estate refused to budge. The band responded by gunning down cattle and making off with 3 horses. It was their only gain. The rich landowners weren't afraid anymore. They had friends in the Mafia, and they knew the separatists were running out of steam. Morale collapsed. Recruits dried up, food ran low, and discipline weakened. By December, Gallo's army numbered 58 men. The mountaintop became a fortress surrounded by 5,000 Italian troops, backed by armour and artillery. The assault came at dawn. The Italians tested the terrain with tanks, then pulled them out when the ground proved too rough, relying instead on mortars and anti-tank guns. Gallo refused to retreat. He dropped into a hole with 2 volunteers and blazed away with a machine gun until it jammed. When he ordered the men to fall back, they refused, choosing to stay and die with him. The 3 embraced and kept shooting until a hand grenade blast put an end to their stand. 6 separatists were wounded. 1 Italian soldier was killed. The rest of Gallo's army, broken and outgunned, abandoned the position that night. Under the cover of darkness, what was left of the separatist force filtered out through the lines. The bandits, now on their own, dragged themselves across the mountains, hunted like animals. By spring, only 8 bandits and a dozen volunteers remained. By the end of that year, only 2 were left alive. For the Mafia, it was an experiment that ended in defeat. The island would remain part of Italy. The bosses would wait, patiently as ever, for their moment to rise again. After the war, the Mafia read the situation for what it was. The separatist cause that had brought together bandits, landowners, and aristocrats was finished. The Allied forces weren't interested anymore, and the new enemy was rising in the form of a strengthened Italian state and its Catholic Church-backed Christian Democrats. The old bosses adjusted quickly. Don Kalo Vizzini, grizzled veteran of countless campaigns, abandoned the separatist illusion and hedged his bets. Whatever promises had been made to the rebels meant nothing if it put the Mafia at risk. He betrayed the separatists' attack plan for western Sicily to police chief Messana, making sure Salvatore Giuliano would walk into a trap. When Giuliano and his men attacked the Carabinieri barracks, the police were ready. They beat him back and bloodied the bandit king's nose. The Mafia chiefs pulled their barons and dukes back to the fold. The feigned popular revolt dissolved, 9/10 of it having been banditry from the start. Meanwhile, peasants in Lentini and Carlentini looted the hoarded granaries as the authorities announced a new chapter for Sicily: autonomy within Italy, amnesty for separatist leaders. The old guard of the movement went free. The rank and file, the petty thugs and gunslingers, would be sacrificed. The Mafia would soon offer itself as the restorer of order. In the countryside, Don Kalo tightened the noose. The honored society acted as executioner and cleaner of its own mess. Bandits were taken down one by one. A handshake became a grip that held a man still until the knife went in. New guns exploded in faces. Friendly visits ended in midnight shootings. The Mafia kept no loyalty for the trash who had served as its weapon. What mattered was expediency. For the low-level bandits, the murderers and highwaymen, the end came quietly. They were hunted down, lured from hiding by promises of amnesty, ambushed and killed. The nights across Sicily became a silent procession of death. Those captured were thrown in cages and tried en masse. At the trial of the rags in 1950, nearly 300 obscure criminals were put behind steel mesh and sentenced to long prison terms. The Mafia had delivered the state a victory and itself a reprieve. The bosses emerged stronger than ever, having eliminated every witness that could haunt them. For Salvatore Giuliano, the outlaw king of Montelepre, the end came with betrayal and a broken promise. By 1947, he was an outlaw, hunted by the state and strangled by the Mafia. Yet he refused to accept the role of common bandit. To the end, he spoke and acted like a soldier, a revolutionary in a land where rebellion had always been a means to an end. Then came the massacre at Portella della Ginestra. The people of Piana dei Greci, long at odds with the Mafia and the state, had defeated the ruling coalition at the polls. On May Day, as thousands of peasants gathered in a mountain pass, the bandit king made his move. His gunners opened fire from the slopes. Bullets ripped through the crowd, tearing apart men, women, and children. The scene was apocalyptic. Animals bled, children screamed, and peasants fell like torn paper. 11 were killed, 55 wounded. The attack had failed as a military operation. The second group of shooters, meant to cut down the peasants as they fled, faltered. Some refused to fire, their sights falling on friends and relatives. The result was a brutal mess. Terror delivered, but nowhere near the scale intended. In the days after the massacre, suspicion fell first on the Mafia. But Police Chief Messana knew better. The order had come from Giuliano. He announced it within hours to the Minister of the Interior, long before any evidence surfaced. Years later, during the Viterbo trial, it emerged that Messana had a confidant inside the bandit ranks. The state and the Mafia had worked together to shape the story, bury the evidence, and bury the witnesses. In the end, the boy from Montelepre, the outlaw soldier, became a weapon for others to use and discard. What had started as a rebellion ended as a bloody footnote. The Mafia emerged from the ashes stronger. The state reasserted its rule, and Salvatore Giuliano was left with nothing. No friends, no honor, and no way out. In the year after Portella and the attacks on trade unionists and communists, Salvatore Giuliano was a hero and a problem. The massacre had worked too well. The Popular Front was crushed at the polls in April 1948, just as intended. But now the bandit was pressing for payment, and the men who had used him were ready to walk away. According to Terra Nova, one of Giuliano's band, the order was clear. Make the people vote Christian Democrat, and you'll have your freedom. But when the votes were counted, the bosses tried to bury the bargain. They spoke of forcing Giuliano and his men to emigrate to Brazil. The bandit refused to go. We must compel these gentlemen to honor their promises, he said. Go to Castellammare del Golfo and kidnap the Honorable Bernardino Mattarella and his family. That was enough. The Mafia had built Giuliano and used him. Now it would destroy him. Santo Flores, the Mafia boss of Partinico, who had brokered the deal, offered a simple solution: turn the bandit over to the authorities. But this time, the trap failed. Giuliano was warned. In a fit of vengeance, he had both Santo Flores and the secretary of the Alcamo Christian Democrats executed. In the bloody aftermath, Giuliano spoke openly about going after the biggest names. Men like Monsignor Filippi, the Archbishop of Monreale, and Don Kalo Vizzini himself. But this was a fantasy. The Mafia had no intention of letting a peasant bandit drag them down. Fra Diavolo, the police spy embedded within Giuliano's gang, acted quickly. Don Kalo sealed himself in the Albergo Sole, surrounded by armed men, until the threat passed. The Archbishop refused to leave the safety of his palace for months. And when Don Kalo finally returned to Villalba, he rode hidden in a produce truck, buried under crates of vegetables, while the bandits stopped the official car and captured only the chauffeur and a hitchhiking friend. Giuliano was a marked man. Abandoned by the Christian Democrats, just as he had been discarded by the separatists and monarchists, he came up with one final weapon: a memorial. The document named names. It laid out the political motives for Portella and implicated its instigators. Copies were made. One was smuggled to America with Giuliano's brother-in-law, Pasquale Shortino. Another was kept closer to hand. The threat was plain. If he was taken alive or killed before these papers were secured, those names would come out. Meanwhile, the state pretended to pursue the bandit while allowing him to operate. Police and army units mounted endless raids that went nowhere. The war became a charade, conducted for the benefit of a horrified public. The breaking point came when Giuliano's band ambushed a squad of carabinieri, killing 8 and wounding 13. The outcry dissolved the old public security organization, headed by Inspector Piero Verdiani, and replaced it with the Force for the Repression of Banditry, led by Colonel Ugo Luca. Luca came with a reputation from intelligence work in the Middle East. The press called him the Italian Lawrence of Arabia, and he acted the part, adopting the flair and clandestine methods of a Somerset Maugham anti-hero. At the sharp end was Maresciallo Lobianco. The Carabiniere set out to make connections within the Mafia. In Monreale, he met Don Nitto Minasola, the unseen lord of that cathedral-topped town, a man feared across western Sicily. Minasola had started life as a shepherd, inheriting 2 scrawny goats and a hard lesson in survival. But he possessed the intelligence, restraint, and ruthlessness that marked every Mafia boss worth fearing. He was still a humble-looking man of 52 when Lobianco came calling. A man with a mask-like face, unreadable and serene. Lobianco came to the point quickly. He wanted Minasola's help to capture Salvatore Giuliano. The boss responded with a long, burning stare, then smiled the faint, cold smile of a man for whom betrayal was second nature. To the Mafia, the bandits were rabble. They had been weapons in a bypassed revolution, and their time was up. The Mafia was back in the saddle. A quiet, brutal version of the Night of the Long Knives was already underway. In the end, the bandit king of Montelepre would find out, like so many before him, that every deal made in Sicily came with a price, and every price came due. For Salvatore Giuliano, the end came from the hand of a friend. Gaspare Pisciotta, second in command, cousin, and lifelong companion, pulled the trigger, but the Mafia aimed it for him. Picciotto remained a fugitive for 5 months after Giuliano's death. When he was finally taken, he was found at home in Montelepre. The police announced it as a hard-won victory. Picciotto said otherwise. "I went to the Questore and gave myself up," he claimed later. In court, he was charged with the Portella della Ginestra massacre and sentenced to life at hard labor. He smiled as the verdict was read, refused any plea for mercy, and said nothing. Years later, a letter surfaced in the press from a man named Giovanni Polacco, a former partisan and Picciotto's neighbor in the Viterbo prison. Polacco revealed that Picciotto had been offered a deal: retract his claims about the massacre, stay silent, and walk free. Polacco refused to be the messenger. Upon release, he vanished, a ghost erased. Picciotto refused too. No threat, no offer of release, no pressure from powerful friends could make him disavow the names he possessed. The Mafia didn't forget. When Picciotto was transferred to the Ucciardone prison in Palermo, a place run from top to bottom by the Mafia, the clock began ticking. The Ucciardone was no ordinary jail. It was a Mafia academy, a rest home for aging bosses, a place where orders were issued and executions arranged. The staff was Mafia-controlled. The governor came and went with the Mafia's blessing. An inquiry in 1957 confirmed the prison's reputation as a stronghold where Mafia capos lived like kings, surrounded by servants, fine meals, and a constant stream of visitors. Picciotto refused to accept that world. To the Mafia, he was too dangerous to live. He was meticulous, wary, making his own coffee every morning. But one day, 2 days before he was due for a court appearance, he added a spoon of vitamin powder prescribed for a chest infection. It was laced with strychnine. In moments, he was on the floor, convulsing, blood running from the corners of his mouth. He tried to save himself, crawling for olive oil to vomit the poison out, but it was too late. They watched him thrash for half an hour until he stopped. As a final measure, the Mafia silenced another witness. Angelo Russo, one of the band still held in the Ucciardone, was given a bottle of fine wine spiced with hemlock. The poison worked quietly, efficiently. The man who administered it was later found dead. With that, the chapter of Giuliano, Picciotto, and the Portella massacre was closed. The last link was gone. The inspector, Verdiani, keeper of too many dangerous secrets, was the final piece. He fell dead one morning, grabbing at his stomach. They called it suicide. Not a Sicilian believed it. The post-war chaos ended. Banditry disappeared. The Mafia returned to its throne. But victory came with its own curse. The old order, men like Don Kalo was rooted in feudal ideas, making money by choking the land, controlling water, and extracting rents from misery. The new Mafia that emerged from the ruins of the war spoke a different language. These were young men, war-hardened, with sharp suits and sharp guns, making $370 a kill. They came from a world shaped by the black market and a brutal new logic. The old Mafia refused to dam the land and unlock its resources, fearing it would ruin their monopoly. The new Mafia wanted to build. New roads, dams, and factories meant billions in kickbacks and contracts. A war of ideas became a war of guns. The old guard lived in an 18th century state of mind. The new generation, cousins and ex-deportees from New York, Kansas City, and Buffalo, came with a 20th century appetite. In Corleone, the bloody shift became literal. The aging doctor and Mafia boss, Michel Navarra, refused to allow a dam project that promised huge profits. His younger rival, Luciano Liggio, murderer of Union man Placido Rizzotto, put a bullet in him and claimed the throne. That murder lit the fuse for a war that never stopped burning. Old bosses and new rivals clawed for power across the island. The city of Palermo became an open grave, its murder rate higher than any other place in Italy. In the markets and alleyways, a bullet meant nothing more than a broken plate. The silence was total. A witness claimed he thought the gunshots were thunder. Another swore he tripped over a body and noticed nothing. Then came the death of Don Kalo Vizzini. Fat, aging and wheezing with a bad heart, he died by the roadside in 1954. They laid him down on the verge, and in a quiet voice, he said, "How beautiful life is." They buried him with honors fit for a king. Politicians, prelates, and bosses came to pay their respects. His body, they said, exuded a sweet, holy fragrance. Just as he had taken the cord of a dead boss years ago to claim the old man's power, now another rose to claim his. In the new era that followed, the Mafia turned its guns and greed to politics. In April 1948, 50 carloads of bosses and guns left a secret meeting with a single order: carry the Christian Democrats to victory. The right came to dominate Sicily for the next 7 years, a reign enforced by Mafia terror. Union leaders were murdered. Politicians were gunned down if the Mafia had a better candidate in mind. The spoils were a new El Dorado, control of the regional assembly and city councils, and with it the future of Sicily. Through murder, betrayal, and brute force, the Mafia reshaped itself for a new era. The old world was gone. The new one was darker, richer, and far more dangerous. Could the Mafia survive its own success? By the early 1960s, that was the question hanging over Sicily. The old guard, seasoned, wary, and rooted in a world of rural honor, now found themselves pushed aside by younger, brasher men fresh from America. The result was a collision of worlds that shook the honored society to its core. In January 1962, Lucky Luciano, living like a prince in Naples, the man long assumed to be the architect of the global narcotics trade, died suddenly while waiting for a flight. The Interpol narcotics squad was closing in, poised to make an arrest. By the time they arrived, Luciano was slumped in a cafe chair, dead. The official cause was a heart attack, but the Italian press said otherwise. To many, it looked like a silent witness. Someone had made sure he wouldn't talk. Into the vacuum stepped Cesare Manzella. A veteran boss of the old school, he was the kind of man still called U Patre Nostru, our Heavenly Father. But times had changed, and old gestures of loyalty no longer protected old men. One night in April 1963, Manzella came home with an associate and found a strange Alfa Romeo blocking the courtyard of his villa. When they opened the door, it exploded. The blast was like a war bomb, and when the smoke cleared, only a hat and a shoe remained. The rest of Manzella and his companion were gone. The papers the police later found, tucked in a satchel, thrown 20 yards by the blast, revealed the threads of a larger story. As the anti-mafia campaign gained force, the bosses had acted quickly, calling a general council and making one order clear: no more internal killings. All disputes were to be arbitrated by a new committee, and any further bloodshed was banned. But a shipment of heroin changed everything. The old Mafia, wary and cautious, had sourced it from the Middle East. The new Mafia, reckless, aggressive, refused to honor old agreements. The resulting feud ignited a chain reaction that shook Palermo. First, Salvatore La Barbera vanished. Only the burned-out shell of his car remained. His brother Angelo tried to run, making it as far as Milan, where he was gunned down. The man thought responsible, the affable Manzella, was eliminated in brutal fashion. The war that followed split the Mafia down the middle. Old versus new. Honor versus greed. It became a race for the throne of Palermo Central, a seat no one could claim openly, and every candidate was hunted down. The old Mafia responded with precision and quiet efficiency. Don Momo Grasso, the boss of Misilmeri, disappeared along with his son. Even his role as Our Lord in the annual Good Friday pageant offered no protection. Then came the car bombs. In June 1963, a parked Alfa Romeo exploded in Villabate, tearing apart a night watchman and a passing baker. The next day, a second Alfa was found in Chiaculi. An anonymous call warned the police not to touch it. But the tire was flat, the car abandoned, and when the army engineers arrived, one man pulled the decoy charge from the back seat. The second charge, hidden in the boot, detonated as soon as the lid was opened. 7 men were killed instantly. The Mafia had blundered. The Chiaculi massacre pushed Palermo into crisis, and the state responded. In a wave of arrests rivaling the brutal days of Mussolini's prefect Mori, the jails of Ucciardoni swelled with hundreds of suspects. The newspapers published page after page of grim, unshaven faces. To the public, these weren't bosses, just the rags of the Mafia, scrawny foot soldiers thrown into the spotlight. The men who really mattered weren't in those photographs. Rumor had it that they were across the border in Switzerland, holed up in a 4-star hotel in Lugano. Then came a shift. Peace returned to Palermo. The cynics were silenced when the big names started appearing in the headlines. Di Peri, Passalacqua, Nicoletti, and the aging Zutanu Filippone, a man of honor in his 80s. The state was making its move. The old order had been broken. What came next would redefine the Mafia for a new era. A brutal, sprawling enterprise that refused to die, no matter how many bombs shook its foundations.